Thank you all for coming to this session on signalized pedestrian crossings at roundabouts. Today we have Hillary Isebrands, who is with the FHWA Resource Center Safety and Design team. And she is going to talk with us about the subject matter, and this will be an open opportunity. So if people have questions, feel free to ask questions. But I'm just go ahead and turn it over to Hillary.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you all for inviting me to come really facilitate a discussion, because I think that's the most important thing, is that to have a conversation about these questions as they come up. So I did prepare a slide deck, and I know we wanted to focus on the signalized piece, but as we all know, beacons come into play when we talk about roundabouts, as well as signals. And I'm going to talk about other treatments and adaptations for roundabouts for pedestrians. So with that, I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and Jessica is going to help me by watching the chat pod while we go through this, Jessica. So you stop me at any point in time. I do have placeholders for discussion after certain topics, but please stop me at any time if there's a question in the chat pod or someone wants to come online. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Let's go. All right, Jessica, are you seeing the slide deck?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. So let's just talk about today's agenda. Again, thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. I'm going to give just a brief kind of fun facts, national roundabout overview, just talk briefly and have TDOT mention, or if they want to say anything about the guidance that is being updated currently. I do have draft copies, and again, so happy to see what you guys have been working on there. I am going to talk about pedestrian crossings at roundabouts, which will include discussion with rectangular rapid flashing beacons, pedestrian hybrid beacons, just flashing beacons, and raised crosswalks. I'm also, I do have materials on the pedestrian and accessibility research at roundabouts. I don't know everyone's background in terms of your knowledge of the research in these areas. So I do have some slides on the pertinent and relevant national research in this area that is actually referenced in your draft roundabout guidance that you have on Tennessee. And then I do have a project actually that was provided that does look at roundabouts near railroad crossings and with the inclusion of RFBs. And I will share in that particular segment, I'm actually going to share some new guidance from Georgia Department of Transportation on railroad crossings. And then we'll wrap up. We'll talk about next steps and see where we're at. So Jessica, are we still go?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, so some fun facts. So the year was 1995. 1995 was the year that in the United States, we had our first roundabout interchange on an interstate highway. It's Interstate 70, that happens to be in Colorado, where you can see we've got kind of a large roundabout with a lot of multi-lane crossings there, coming off interstate on and off ramps, and a frontage road. And then on the north side, you can see there's actually a frontage road that has a teardrop type design. So believe it or not, that was built in 1995, and it still stands today exactly the way it was designed many, many years ago. So since then, and at that point in time, we probably had definitely less than 50 roundabouts in the United States. So if we fast forward to 2022, we actually probably have closer to about 7,000 to 8,000 roundabouts in the United States. Some fun facts here in 2022, our pedestrian hybrid beacons are becoming common treatments at multi-lane roundabouts. Rectangular rapid flashing beacons are finally an official FHWA proven safety countermeasure, and they're also hopefully scheduled to be official in the next update to the MUTCD. We do have 12 states that have a formal intersection control evaluation policy. We know that we are having more and more conversations about the safe system approach. And the good news is roundabouts really are a poster child for a safe system approach in terms of its lower speeds, it's reducing conflict points. And so oftentimes it is first and foremost one of the examples that is provided in terms of a safe system approach when it comes to intersections. If you're familiar with turbo roundabouts, we actually have our first turbo roundabout in the United States that was built in Jacksonville, Florida, that finished up construction at the end of 2021. And there's a second turbo roundabout project that will be constructed in California. That project was just let. Carmel, Indiana is really our roundabout capital of the United States. They have over 140 roundabouts in their jurisdiction, just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. And another fun fact, if you like to listen to podcasts, roundabouts have their very own episode on Freakonomics podcast. So if you haven't had a chance to take a listen to that, they do provide both a national and international perspective on roundabouts as it relates to economics. So moving ahead, just want to let you all know that the current national guidance is NCHRP 672 that was published back in 2010. And NCHRP is in the process right now of updating that guide. I do sit on that panel as the FHWA liaison. And we are expecting really the final, we've gone through almost a first draft of half the chapters. We expect that to be balloted towards the end of 2022 with a publication date, probably early 2023 for the update to the National Roundabout Guidance. The good news is much of what you all have included in the update to TDOT's roundabout design guidance is pulling from a lot of the research that has happened since 2010 and is going to be already included in your roundabout guidance. So I think that's a great testimony in terms of you all bringing really the latest and greatest research in addition to NCHRP 672 to your updated guidance that is coming forward. I am going to note, again, because we are specifically talking about pedestrians and signalization today, that there is an element that is included on the left-hand side there from your guidance that is really an adaptation from Massachusetts Department of Transportation. It is really the first, I'm going to say, substantive guidance that we have seen from a state DOT that is really looking at the accessibility elements, the safety elements, and the operational elements of pedestrian crossings and the various treatments and adaptations that we have for pedestrian accessibility and pedestrian crossings at roundabouts. So we can dive more into this as needed, but kudos to you all for picking up on what MassDOT has done. Because again, I think that is actually some of the most comprehensive guidance that I have seen, bringing together all of the research that really has gone on for the last 15 plus years related to pedestrian crossings and accessibility at roundabouts. So I am going to pause there and just see if anyone wants to say anything about your the update that's coming for the roundabout guidance. Or anything else that anyone wanted to touch on before I dive into the treatments themselves.
Jason Quicksaw, I think you have a question.
I do. My question is concerning the PROAG requirement. So that the previous graph you showed there with the 2-lane exits or 2-lane entry. So it looks like there wouldn't be pedestrians activated signals required on there for a lot, unless the speed or ADT warranted. But on PROAG, they require at 306 3.3.2, they have a shall statement saying you have to have a pedestrian activated signal anytime you have a multi-lane pedestrian street crossing at a roundabout.
So you're correct. That is what the current draft PROAG states. Since that was published, really all of this research, except for the original NCHRP 674, which was accessibility at multi-lane roundabouts and channelized turn lanes, all the research has come since that draft PROAG and the comment period occurred. And so there's been this dialogue and evolution really of accessibility at multi-lane roundabouts and work with the U.S. Access Board, federal highways, really practitioners at large. This additional research on rectangular rapid flashing beacons that I'm going to talk about that federal highways did, and the subsequent NCHRP projects 834 that you all are referencing in your update has really allowed us to learn more about accessibility and the different performance measures that are needed to really assess accessibility at multi-lane roundabouts. So you are correct. You even had you knew the number in the PROAG, the reference number. It does say signal. It does say pedestrian signal. At that point in time, we were calling the pedestrian hybrid beacon was called a hawk. So the good news is what I'm going to present is really what the profession, including the Access Board, have talked about in terms of comments that have come through the comment period and really an understanding of where we've come since that language was provided and asked for comment, and what we are using our engineering judgment in terms of what treatments do actually provide accessibility at multi-lane roundabouts. So I'm going to touch on this again after I present some of the examples of RFBs and THBs, but you are spot on. That is exactly what the draft PROAG says. From what I have seen in your language, where you guys again referred to all of the research that has occurred since that draft language was out there, is really what we're seeing as a noteworthy practice. What many states are doing is they're drawing on the recent research to help guide them to provide this type of guidance to practitioners. And so, yes, it does not match what was in that draft language from actually long ago, but it is more consistent with what we have seen. And even the Access Board, who has presented and spoken at the TRB Roundabouts Committee, it is consistent in terms of looking at everything that you see here, which is RFBs, raised crosswalks, pedestrian hybrid beacons, as well as your traditional signalized crossing if you so choose. So Jason, I hope that helps. Again, the PROAG is what it is in terms of what is printed. And that's why it's super important that, if you have that already adopted within your agency, that some states have actually adopted it and done an exception for roundabouts with guidance such as similar to what you guys have actually provided here in your draft language. Does that help at all, Jason?
It does, yeah, because again, it is a shall statement, according to that. So I've been taking the bad news around to roundabout designs for some time now. Letting people know that they're not in compliance with PROAG, because I mean, in our, we have to follow that unless we can justify it somehow. And we may, as we update this guidance, that may be the next step then, I guess.
Right.
But okay, thank you.
Yep. In some states have, like New York is an example where they did adopt the PROAG, but then they did have to qualify or do an exception for the multi-lane roundabout. So that's something that as you finalize your draft guidance there is to make sure that it doesn't somehow conflict with anything that you or what you may have adopted from the PROAG perspective. And so that's an important detail though from a policy perspective to consider. All right, great. Yeah. Any other questions, Jessica?
I don't see any right now.
Okay. All right. So here we go. So I'm going to talk, I'm going to try to provide examples so we can speak to the examples as best as possible. So we're going to talk about pedestrians, and we do always, as we know, as designers and practitioners, we need to think of all abilities and types of pedestrians that we have, whether that's a child or someone in the aging population, someone who's sight impaired, someone who's mobility impaired. And so what does that look like, and what are our options when it comes to roundabouts? The other piece of it is we all, again, this is a safe system principle, is acknowledging the risk of vulnerable population, which pedestrians in this case. So we know that the faster we're going, the less likelihood it is to survive a crash if you were hit by a vehicle as a pedestrian. And that's, again, why it's so critical. And if you look at the principles of roundabout design, we're trying to really design those roundabouts to be with an average speed between 15 and 25 miles an hour, which really puts us in that space where most pedestrians, if they are hit, will survive that type of a crash. If you look at traditional intersections with, whether it is a free flow type situation through an intersection or a signalized intersection with a posted speed or even an operating speed, we know that there is a difference with roundabouts versus stop control versus signalized intersections. And that's where roundabouts get a lot of their safety benefit, is because no matter what the posted speed is in advance of the intersection, drivers are traveling between 15 and 25 miles per hour. So this is just an example on the right. This is actually from Asheville, North Carolina on College Avenue, where, again, I mentioned the lower speeds, the fewer conflict points, shorter crossing distances, and then crossing one direction of travel at a time. So this is a before and after. This was actually a road diet that was done on that particular corridor. And you can see there, you've got, a typical signalized intersection, 2 through lanes, a left turn lane, a right turn lane. And you've got, again, you can see the crosswalks there, which were just the longitudinal markings. That was transformed into a corridor, again, through a road diet with a roundabout replacing the signalized intersection, and really going from a 4-lane roadway with a 2-way left-hand turn lane to a 2-lane roadway with bike lanes and parking. So really that, again, that transformation of what that experience is for the driver and for the pedestrian. I always say, consider yourself a pedestrian at that location with the signal, and now consider yourself at that same location when it's a roundabout, in terms of what kind of environment that is for you. It's also important to think about, what is that like for maybe a child pedestrian or someone who is blind or someone who is mobility impaired? What kind of experience do they have in one situation versus the other?
Hillary, we have a question or a hand raised. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Rochelle, do you have a question?
I do. I was wondering, well, first, where is this, other than Asheville? Do you know, like
College Avenue?
College Avenue?
Yep.
And then my
huge signalized intersection. So we're facing west. Right behind us is a huge signalized intersection.
Right behind us is a huge. Okay, great. And then, do you have any information about what the traffic report, like the traffic impact study that was done before this decision was made, or what kind of traffic counts were done here?
I do not off the top of my head. Anthony Butzik was actually worked at the city then. I believe then he was a consultant after that. But clearly, anytime you do a road diet, and typically our road diets, if we go from a 5 to a 2, we're usually in the 15,000 to, I'd say, 22,000 ADT volume range. However, there are a lot of road diets across the country that we've seen actually having traffic volumes of up to 27,000 ADT, where a 5 to 2 lane road diet has actually functioned very well with roundabouts. Does that help you, Rochelle? Okay. Thanks for the question. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the treatments. So again, I try to, for those of you that are very visual, I've got the photos and then hopefully follow that up with some narrative as well. This happens to be a single lane crossing, happens to be a very kind of peaking area. It is a frontage road actually next to an interstate where they did install the rectangular rapid flashing beacons. This is a single lane crossing. This is a transit route. And it actually is an alternate route when the interstate closes for all the traffic on the interstate to be going through this particular location. So that's just an example there with the photo, but I'm gonna share many more examples because I'm gonna start off with rectangular rapid flashing beacons, then I'll go to hybrid pedestrian hybrid beacons, flashing beacons, and raised crosswalks. So here's an example. This actually roundabout's been in place for I'm gonna say over 10 years. This happens to be actually just outside the Washington State DOT state building offices in Olympia, Washington. And so a lot of folks are parking in a parking garage and then they walk across the street to head into the state building campus. And so this is a full multi-lane roundabout. It actually, this particular approach is an off-ramp of the interstate that leads into, again, that more of the downtown area of Olympia, Washington. They have all of their crossings, it's a four-legged intersection, 2 lanes on each approach with rectangular rapid flashing beacons. So I do have, so there's a still image on the left. I have some video. Now I hope that the quality of the video is going to be good here, but we'll just take a second and watch this video. Let me know if it's not, Jessica, but you'll see. So you can see the rectangular rapid flashing beacon here is going, that person is crossing. Notice that the beacon, you can see it actually on the far side. There's someone crossing actually on the other side. That's actually the exit that comes off of the interstate. In this case, you just have the rectangular rapid flashing beacons on the outside. There is not one actually in the median. There's not a beacon or a sign in the median at this particular design. We'll see a couple of examples later where you actually do see the supplemental signs as well as the beacons that create more of that 2-stage crossing versus a single stage crossing. So you can see that gentleman there crossing. Again, the beacon's going, here comes someone else. That crossing, that approach right there is an off ramp of the interstate. And then that's the on ramp on this side. Okay. Here's another example from Davidson, North Carolina. This particular location was a part of some research related to accessibility and multi-lane roundabouts. You can see here the difference is you do see the supplemental sign in the median for the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. Okay, so this could become more of the 2-stage crossing where you actually do hit the button again in the center island for the 2-stage crossing. And this is where you can actually separate the entrance from the exit and create that 2-stage crossing if you do design it in this fashion. Those are also solar powered. I think the other ones were as well. Here's another example. This is from Gahanna, Ohio, which is just outside of Columbus, Ohio. You can see here that this location actually has the zigzag crossing in the median or in the splitter island itself. So again, this one actually has a 2-lane approach on the entry and it's a single lane exit. However, it was designed for future that it could be a 2-lane exit coming off of the state highway there. This is an example, again, with the stagger. So 2-stage crossing, you are going to have to activate that push button in the center island. This also is the location. So the image is on the right. That's actually me in the middle of the road, and the center photo out there with Patricia Kovatz and her friend Mary, who are advocates in the Columbus, Ohio area for sight impaired and blind folks. And so I have spent the afternoon with them out there. Mary was born blind. She does have a guide dog. And so we spent a lot of time together, me learning from both Patricia and Mary on what the experience is like crossing a roundabout when you are sight impaired, as well as how she's navigating that, how she finds the accessible pedestrian signal, and just having a conversation about that. So that's just another example, again, with the zigzag with the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. I'm going to take a moment just to talk briefly about the zigzag or the offset. So on the approach there, that's the traditional design where we would see about 1 car length. So the pedestrian crossing being about 1 car length behind the yield line. And then the zigzag away on the exit, what that does, it actually allows for a driver a little bit more time to react to the pedestrian on the exit. And it also allows for some storage if there's a higher volume or during peak periods for a couple of cars to actually queue up while the pedestrians are actually crossing. So those are some of the advantages that we have seen by actually having the offset or zigzag type design where the exits, because we actually, in the research that we've done, the exits do not have as good of yielding behavior as the entrances do. There's another video here. This is a 3-lane approach to a multi-lane roundabout. There's an exclusive right on the side. This actually used to be a raised crosswalk, and they, through a resurfacing project, they actually went with the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So there's not much of a raised crosswalk here. Oh, hold on. I'll do that again. Nothing special, just wanted you to see that's what it looks like with a 3-lane approach. There's some additional markings you can see there that were a carryover from the raised crosswalk. So I'm going to just pause there in case there's any questions about the rectangular rapid flashing beacon before I move on to the pedestrian hybrid beacon.
I will say that there is a comment in the chat box from Elza Vista regarding not County's experience with RRFBs or putting the supplemental RRFB in the median. Apparently, they've been having out of control drivers hit them. Are you saying, Ellen, that they hit the actual RRFB or they hit people? Can you elaborate a little more?
They're hitting the RRFB and taking them out, even though it's embedded in an island, a pedestrian refuge island. So that's, one of the lessons we've learned here is not to put those in the middle of the island on a high-speed facility, because people are driving so out of control that they can't help but hit the beacon.
And so is that at mid-block crossings or at roundabouts?
That's at mid-blocks, not at roundabouts.
Okay.
So higher speed, certainly.
Okay.
Just throwing it out there.
Okay. No, that's good. And so 2 points I'll make there is one, we've, technically at roundabouts, we should have drivers slowing. So we hope that we don't get them in the median. Secondly, the guidance and recommendations that have come out of the accessibility research actually have pretty strong language about providing that supplemental, whether it's for the pedestrian hybrid beacon or the RFB in the splitter island or in the median at a roundabout. So again, for discussion, as you look at roundabout projects. Thank you for sharing that.
And then Nathan just provided a comment saying that lighting of the median island is very important.
Great, thank you for adding that. All right, so pedestrian hybrid beacons. So back in, I want to say 2006, 2007 timeframe, that's where actually it was about the time when actually the first version of the draft ProEg came out. And there was a clear need that we needed to do more research at multi-lane roundabouts related to accessibility, as well as channelized turn lanes. And so from that was born this project called NCHRP 674 that has an extremely long name, but really it's looking at the accessibility of multi-lane roundabouts and channelized, actually roundabouts in general, and channelized turn lanes. And so from that, this actually was a temporary installation in Golden, Colorado. You can actually see on the bottom left, that is actually the entrance. And on the upper right, that's actually the exit of that same roundabout with the pedestrian hybrid beacon. So this was a temporary installation as part of the research project to really evaluate the safety, accessibility, and effectiveness of a pedestrian hybrid beacon at a multi-lane roundabout. Prior to this, it's safe to say that maybe there was actually only one other location in the United States that actually had a pedestrian hybrid beacon, or at that point, they would still been called a hawk, at a roundabout. So you can see there on the left, I'm hoping most of you are familiar with the phases of the pedestrian hybrid beacon, but this is really the first research that we had, and then ultimately that was published in the 2009-2010 timeframe, and I'll share some of those results with you a little bit later, but just wanted to show this particular example to you because it really was the first and really gave us a first sense of how do drivers react to pedestrian hybrid beacons, how do pedestrians, and then how do sight impaired and blind pedestrians. So there was actually sight impaired and blind pedestrians that were participants as a part of this research project, along with mobility and orientation specialists. Here's another location that has the pedestrian hybrid beacon with the mast arms. You can see that that has the zigzag or the offset type design for the crossing between the entrance and the exit. So just gives you a slightly different perspective with the mast arms. And then here's another example I'm going to share with you. This is actually what it looks like overhead view. They actually replaced a huge structure with a couple of multi-lane roundabouts. This also, you can see they've got signal head per lane, and they do have the zigzag at this location as well to, again, provide that separation, allow for the vehicles on the exit to be queuing up as they exit, as well as provide that good sight distance for those exiting the roundabout to be able to see the pedestrians and be able to stop at the pedestrian hybrid beacon. So similar to what we saw with the offset or zigzag design with the RFB, but in this case, clearly we've got the pedestrian hybrid beacon. This particular location, they have every weekend they have huge like flea markets in the area, so they have a lot of pedestrians coming to this area. So although you can see a few folks on the right-hand side, there's actually a hospital and part of a university campus not too far from here as well. Got another location here. This actually, depending on which side of the interstate, it has different treatment on both sides of the interstate. This happens to be a project just outside of Denver, Colorado. And you can see it's kind of a complicated intersection. This was all signalized prior to the roundabouts going in, but they actually have a pedestrian hybrid beacon on the off ramp off of the interstate and to Pecos, which is a community or a corridor, a major arterial that goes north-south through Denver. There happened to be a school actually on the corner, and most of the kids lived on the other side of the interstate. So they did design and install the pedestrian hybrid beacon at this location. And you can see there, again, that's what is on the left. So a pedestrian bridge takes them across the interstate, and then they push the button for the pedestrian hybrid beacon. You can see here the lighting. So I don't see the top of the lighting, but the top of the light is there with the pole, and then you've got the mast arm and then the supplemental, both actually left and right on this off ramp, right? So it's just one way at this particular location. On the other side, so I'm just going to flip back. So the one we just looked at is right here. So now on the other side, they actually decided to go with a flashing beacon on the other side. So this is the spot where you're actually coming out of the roundabout. Speeds are a little bit lower. So they did not go with the pedestrian hybrid beacon on this side of the interstate. So this is actually where the pedestrians, they're originating on this side of the interstate. They are crossing actually a single lane. They head to the on-ramp, a single lane on-ramp, and they've got a flashing beacon. They cross over the interstate, and then they actually are cross a 2-lane approach on the exit ramp and head over to school. All right, so let's talk about pedestrian hybrid beacons, and then I've got actually an example that I'm going to shift more over to, just one example from just a flashing beacon. Any questions about the pedestrian hybrid beacons here? Okay, and you know, if you think of something later, just jot it down or put it in the chat pod and we'll come back to it. All right, so I just want to show another example. This also—
Yeah, Vita just dropped a question in the chat.
Sure.
Vita just put I don't know if she wants to ask
Yeah,
it, but
I can ask it. Just your thoughts, or kind of, are there any issues with using PHBs and RFBs so closely together, even in instances where we're looking at corridors, like mixing and matching? Like, is there user confusion? Just kind of feedback on the use of mixing the two types of
generally,
signals.
I would say, yeah, I mean, let's ask ourselves that question. And in this case, it's actually just a flashing beacon. It's not even an RFB on the other side of this one. I'll be very honest about this project. I came in later, actually. They had a value engineering on the whole project. It was a bridge replacement project, actually, when they were redoing the whole, really the whole interchange area. And originally they actually didn't have anything other than just the crosswalk. And so through the value engineering process, we really talked about the importance of providing that additional treatment at the crosswalk. It's a school, high speeds, and to be honest, there was at one point in time discussion about having the pedestrian hybrid beacon on both sides, but ultimately the designer, this was actually a CMGC project, the designer and the project owner decided that they were different enough that they wanted to not do a pedestrian hybrid beacon on the other side, with it being a single lane and the speeds being lower. That was their decision. I prefer, like you pointed out, I do like to see consistency. Interestingly enough, on this project right here, there's actually a head signal. So a traditional green, yellow, red signal for a mid-block crossing right here, and there's another one right here. So they actually have a green, yellow, red pedestrian signal. They have a flashing beacon, and they have a pedestrian hybrid beacon, and then another pedestrian signal, all within a couple thousand feet. I think you're spot on to be asking that question about consistency, particularly on a corridor or in a community where RFBs and or PHBs are new, because that's so important from the human factors perspective when we look at the driver reaction, the yielding rates, and really just sheer driver behavior, as well as pedestrians too, right? Because even pedestrians, particularly if you're going to talk about maybe the aging population or younger pedestrians, sometimes at their level, they're just pushing a button. They don't, especially for younger kids, they don't necessarily, if they're not paying attention, they might think, oh, well, oh my, it's the red, I get the red light here. Well, what if it's the flashing beacon? And so I think that there is definitely a level of human factors, human behavior piece that you want to think about. So consistency, we always say, like, consistency is so important, as well as for the pedestrian, as well as for the driver, and simplify and clarify. And I think simplifying and clarifying is being consistent as well. So thank you for that question, Vita. So this location just happens to be, is actually, there's 3 schools near this multi-lane roundabout. There's actually 2 multi-lane roundabouts here. where they, again, wanted to have a little bit more visibility, where they have a lot of kids crossing the street here. So they went with the overhead, kind of a lightweight mast arm with just the flashing beacon. And this one is actually just on during school hours. So this does not flash, and it's not PED activated. So this is actually just on during the school hours. It is a flashing beacon. So that's another variation, if you will, in terms of designing for the context. The other crossings here, when this project was built, it just had the traditional sign and high visibility markings. This location has evolved, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But this was like this for probably about 10 years before they changed the treatments at the crossings. And they changed it not because of pedestrian safety, they actually changed it because of driver behavior. Okay, so any questions about beacons? And then I'm going to talk about raised crosswalks. Okay. So this is just a conceptual drawing of what, again, it might look like if you've got a raised crosswalk, how you would have to maybe slightly modify the location of the crossing. Because now you've created that raised crosswalk, so you have to allow for that transition for the depth, whatever the depth of that crosswalk is going to look like for the raised crossing piece. So let's look at some examples. This actually is that same example back in Golden, Colorado, but at a, actually it's at the same location. It's just a modification to the crosswalk itself. Instead of the pedestrian highway beacon, it is a raised crosswalk. All right, so that was part of that research, that original research that was done in the late 2000s to help guide us in terms of knowing how drivers behave with raised crosswalks and whether or not we provide accessibility for sight impaired pedestrians when it comes to multi-lane roundabouts. So there's one example. You can see that was clearly a retrofit. That was a retrofit at an existing location. So drainage was a little tricky there. But that is sometimes anytime we retrofit anything, there's definitely some challenges that go with it. This is a project here. I share the plan drawing just because, and we can come back to it. What originally actually was designed, they actually modified it pretty quickly after it was constructed and open to traffic. So this doozy is in Austin, Texas. This is off of Interstate 35. This is 51st Street. And so here is the exit ramp here. You've got, Texas does all these fun frontage roads and loop connectors, but this is actually the exit off of here. Here's 51st Street. And then you've got the on-ramp at this particular location. So originally when this was designed, it was actually a 3-lane combination of a 1, 2, and 3-lane roundabout. Okay, happened to be involved in this process as well. They weren't sure what they were going to do with the pedestrian crossings. Well, ultimately, what they decided was a raised crosswalk. And then later they added on flashing beacons at this particular location. So it is a raised crosswalk. Again, higher speeds coming off the interstate. You can see on the right, that's actually a bypass lane where you've got a single lane crossing. They did not put the beacon on that side, but they've got on the main line where you're actually yielding at the roundabout, they've got the flashing beacons that are PED activated with a raised crosswalk. So again, that's another variation of what it might look like for an adaptation or treatments at a multi-lane roundabout. I've got a video here. It's not anything specific to the pedestrian crossings, but it can just give you an idea of what this one looks like. So where you see the yellow paint, that actually, when they opened it, it was actually a 3rd lane through there. And take a look. It's pretty high volume.
And Hillary, we have a question.
Sure.
Whenever you have a chance.
Go ahead.
Rochelle had her hand up. I don't know if you still have a question, Rochelle.
Well, I was wondering if maybe you're gonna get to this later, but the kind of the preferred treatment given all the, you know, trade-offs between these different kinds of infrastructure and all the different guidelines we have. So if there's some hard and fast rules for what kind of infrastructure one should be using at, you know, at each location with its own specific, basically what's the context sensitivity behind all this, and, you know.
Right, so what I'm going to do is come back to a slide. I'll go through, there's a couple more slides here, but I'm going to go back to something that I showed up front, which was that kind of those graphics of proposed guidance borrowed or adapted from Massachusetts DOT, to talk a little bit more about that, because you use the word context, and absolutely context is so important. But we also need safety, context, and accessibility. And so I'm going to come back to that. So I'm going to just make a note that I'm going to jump back on my slides in a second. So thanks for that question, Rochelle. I'll come back to that. So here's a location. This is also from Hilliard, Ohio. So I showed that flashing beacon earlier. This is the sister roundabout to the one that I showed with the flashing beacon with the school crossing. So this is a location where they actually really struggled with property damage only crashes. And it wasn't bike safety, it wasn't pedestrian safety. Again, they've got 3 schools, like 4,000 students that are coming through this in the morning. And they really were having lane utilization problems and driver behavior issues at this roundabout. So they actually went with the raised crosswalks at this location. You can see the enhanced marking. It is different. We don't have many locations like this, but this is an example of really a location where they were having speed issues. They were having people changing lanes in the middle of the roundabout. And they had a lot of pedestrians and bicyclists that were kids in this area. So the raised crosswalks really changed the kind of the before and after at this location, really changed the behavior of the drivers at this location. They feel like the pedestrians were better seen with the raised crosswalks. They had lower speeds, and they had better lane utilization at this roundabout after they went with the raised crosswalks. So again, this was a retrofit after they had some issues at this particular location, but it is a real nice example of how they have really good speed control after the raised crosswalks went in, and they're very happy with the reduction in the property damage only crashes after they went forward with the retrofit at this particular location. This is that same location. It's just at driver's eye. You can see they did the kind of the lightweight mast arm with the lane usage signs up above. Very gradual in terms of what you see there with the raised crosswalk. It was not meant to be significant. They worked very closely with fire and their maintenance folks to make sure that they weren't going to hang people up on a raised crosswalk. Like I said, this was a retrofit. However, they did it with a resurfacing project, so they were able to kind of smooth it in as part of that resurfacing project at that location. Notice they actually do not have RFBs or actually beacons at this location. They have they just have the raised crosswalk as for their treatment. I just share this. This is something that is emerging more. There's some examples in Florida where you're actually separating peds and bikes. If you've got a lot of peds and bikes, whether it's at a roundabout or it's at a signalized intersection, some people refer it to as the protected intersection when you're talking about a signalized option, where you do have the option to be separating peds and bikes a little bit further. Again, we're borrowing this and adapting it from the Netherlands, but there are some locations and more kind of the ones I have seen on the ground in the US have been more neighborhood style designs. But again, if you look at the Complete Streets guide from Massachusetts, they have put that in there as an option. I'm going to stop there. I actually want to go back to Rochelle's question. Here. So, and it actually goes back to Jason's question too. So we know what the draft PROAG says. It says a signalized crossing. The research that we have we've had here in the US. We've researched rectangular rapid flashing beacons, raised crosswalks, pedestrian hybrid beacons, and some other, I'm going to say, innovative like rumble strips and a couple of other details or treatments that have been looked at here in the United States. But by and large, the RFB, the pedestrian hybrid beacon, and the raised crosswalk have really, those are the elevated, in addition to a traditional signal, have been elevated as providing safe and accessible crossings. And although we don't have it in writing from US Access Board, this is really where the research has led us, is these being the options for treatments, in addition to the high visibility markings and the signing themselves. So, but what it comes down to is really these variables. And I want to hit this first, and then I'm actually going to share the research with you guys, because you're going to see some of the performance measures that they used to really help you get to what is the best solution for my particular location. So here you can see on the left, I'll talk about what's actually, I'm going to have to move this so I can see it. I'm actually going to talk to the right. So on the right-hand side, that's again from the Massachusetts DOT guidelines. So on the bottom left, you can see you've got speed, and then you've got the vehicular volume. Okay, so that's where notice it's not pedestrian volume, but it's talking about the vehicle speed and the vehicular volume. And so super important, because we know that the speed is important in our design, but also, what's that car going to be driving as they either are going over the crosswalk on the entrance or the exit. And so this shows you that when you've got the higher volumes, that the RFB and the signal, or PHB in this case, seem to be the solution of choice based on the performance measure. So again, you can look at yielding behavior, you can look at speeds, you can look at PED volume, you can look at vehicle volumes, because we know with the pedestrian hybrid beacon, we have warrants in the MUTCD for when we might utilize a pedestrian hybrid beacon, but we always can use engineering judgment for a particular location, or really for designing, ultimately making the decision of what you might have at your crossings. Notice the difference between the exit and the entrance. And going back to Vita's comment about consistency, I think it's definitely worth thinking about that. So even though on the entrance and the exit here, shown on the right, you might come up with a different solution based just using your speed and your volumes in this location, or at a particular entry or exit, you might get a different treatment, but you do need to think about the consistency of that. One of the reasons why the entry and the exit is different is because all of our research in the United States has shown that the yielding rates are much lower on the exits. But I also mentioned that that's also why we have seen actually better yielding rates when the crosswalk is a little bit further away from the roundabout on the exits as well. So I think it's good to go through, clearly this is guidance, go through the process of utilizing the guidance that you have, but at the end of the day, you need to look at consistency. You need to look at safety, accessibility, context, to ultimately get what you need to have for your project. There are some states that have said any multi-lane crossing that we have, we are going to do a pedestrian hybrid beacon, regardless of the traffic volume, regardless of the pedestrian volume. We're sticking with the PHB, and that's their prerogative. Any agency through, again, documentation, through consultation with the advocates in the community, and through peer data and research, it is ultimately designing your, in this case, roundabout to what is the safest and most accessible for all of our users. So I know, Rochelle, there is not a preferred for, it's not, you can't just say, oh, always use a PHB. Now, some agencies have done that, and an agency can still do that, but sometimes having some flexibility in terms of, your budget for your project, in terms of, we've had advocates that also are not on the same page of a PHB versus a signal versus a RFB versus a raised crosswalk. So that's why it's best to, document engineering judgment and use these, which really are newer tools that we have and guidance that we have available to us. There's just a couple of DOTs that even have guidance like this. There are some local agencies that have guidance specific to roundabouts related to the treatments or adaptations at crosswalks. But this is really, the first we're seeing it in some of our state DOT guidance in the last couple of years.
Hillary, we had a question from Nathan Batter. Are there any recommendations for how far to put these downstream from the exit based on exit speed, etc.? And then he said, this sounds like a good study.
Yes. So the research, through Federal Highways research and through the NCHRP 834 research, there's kind of a sweet spot, if I can use that term, between 30 and 70 feet. Okay, so between 30, I'm going to actually go to. All right, so I'm going to go to the upper left there. So really, the crosswalk on the entry is 1 car length or about 25 feet from the circulatory roadway or the yield line. So that's about 25 feet. What the research has actually shown us is if the exit is between 30 and 70 feet, 30 and 70 feet. Now, again, it's gonna number of lanes, the speeds, pedestrian, the crossing, what do you have a zigzag? How much storage room do you have for pedestrians in the middle? Those are all variables that we want to talk about. Geometry, what is the R3 for those designers with us today? What is the exit speed that we would be expecting, the radius and the exit speed that we would be expecting for vehicles to come out of the roundabout? Again, that volume is important too, in terms of maybe providing some storage as vehicles are exiting and their tail end is not stuck back in the roundabout itself. So 30 to 70 is what you'll see in the research that we've done thus far in the United States. Now, we've got a lot more locations now that I wish we had a bunch of money that we could go back and actually study that a little bit further. But that is kind of what we're working with right now. Nathan, does that help?
Yeah, and I just put it in the chat that you prefer 70 feet for like dual lane exits and then 30 feet for more urban designs with lower speeds. Is that the preference?
Maybe I don't think it's that simple. I think really it has to do with, and actually let's hold that thought, Nathan, because I'm actually going to show you something here from the performance measures from the research that that will hopefully help us get to the answer there. Okay, so let's hold that thought. So here's the research. So I mentioned 674, which is the crossing solutions at roundabouts and channelized turn lanes, that actually was published back in 2009. So that's that example from Golden, Colorado. Okay. In fact, here is, if you compare the pedestrian hybrid beacon and the raised crosswalk in Golden, if I look at the before and after, so the before is going to be a 2-lane roundabout. So I'm going to look at the crossing sign and marking only, right? So this is just a crossing, the high visibility crossing and the sign. For the orientation and mobility intervention rate. So that's when someone has to tell the pedestrian that is sight impaired or blind, don't cross. Like they wanted to cross and you have to say, don't cross. That's the intervention rate. So when it was just the high visibility marking and the sign itself, there was a 2.4 to 2.8 intervention rate at this location. And the average ped delay was about 16 to 17 seconds. Okay, so before that pedestrian wanted to initiate, needed to wait, and then cross. Afterwards, if you looked at the pedestrian hybrid beacon, so right there with the picture you have there, 0 orientation and mobility. And again, that's because there's the accessible pedestrian push button, and it'll say walk light is on. Okay, so there was actually 0 intervention when the red light went on. And then in terms of the average ped delay, was actually 5.8 seconds. And that, again, that's just the time for the pedestrian to decide that they are actually going to cross the roadway. For the raised crosswalk example at this location, but on the other side, it was actually, again, 0. So the interventionist did not have to, stop a crossing from someone who is sight impaired or blind. So that's good, right? That's the same. So 0 for red light with the beacon, 0 for the raised crosswalk. And then the delay was slightly higher for the raised crosswalk versus the pedestrian hybrid beacon. In both cases, much better than the before, okay? And from this research, that's where it's like, all right, so there's a lot of promise with raised crosswalks. There's a lot of promise with pedestrian hybrid beacons. And so much so that that's when the access board is like, all right, well, these look like options in addition to the pedestrian signal that we see called out. Fast forward, now the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So federal highways, we funded some accessibility research on rectangular rapid flashing beacons and multi-lane roundabouts. And so these were some of the evaluation performance measures that were used to determine whether or not the RFB was accessible. And so I think these are also important when you kind of come down and you're making those decisions is, so the degree of curve. So for you geometricians or design people on the call today, so when the degree of curve goes up, the radius goes down. And when we have a tighter radius to navigate at an intersection, we tend to drive slower, okay? So when the radius is smaller, our speeds are slower, okay? So that your free flow speed is slower. The yielding rates go up, which is a good thing, and the interventions go down. So the important piece is that the geometry is super important. Those radii are very important. How you design that roundabout in terms of really being in that 15 to 25 miles per hour as you look at the design speeds is very, very important. And then let me see if I'm going to jump ahead. That's the result. So those components, so it's that geometric piece, there's that driving those speeds down, and there's the reaction of the driver or the yielding rates if the driver reacting to, in this case, the RFB. So based on that research for rectangular rapid flashing beacons, this is where we're talking about that the RFBs should be installed at 2-stage crossings with separate devices. And I mentioned that earlier. They should be installed at both ends of the crosswalk. They should be as visible as possible, right? So if you've got trees or vegetation or landscaping, you need to be very aware where that is, in addition to other signs that you might have, right? We don't want signs to block signs. And then last but not least, outfitted with audible devices, right? So we need to make sure it's the accessible pedestrian signal at the RFB so that they know that the light is on. I'm going to go through, this is the most recent research we have, which is really part 2 of that study that was started in 2009. And what that really ultimately talked about was that treatments need to be geared towards reducing vehicle speeds through geometric modifications that might include speed humps, raised crosswalks, or geometric changes. Treatments, again, provide accessibility that are geared towards enhancing visibility of the crosswalk and alerting drivers, such as RFBs or other beacons. Treatments that are geared at providing additional audible information to blind pedestrians, which includes sounds or rumble strips. And then treatments geared at stopping traffic and creating crossing opportunities, which can include the pedestrian hybrid beacon and other pedestrian signals. So these are just some of the elements that have come out of that research. And ultimately, it's looking at geometry. It's looking at the speeds of the vehicles, the sight distance and visibility that that driver has, both on the entry as well as on the exit. Because remember, that's a different, when you're driving through a roundabout and you come out of the, you're focused on getting through the circular intersection, and then all of a sudden, bam, crosswalk. I need to be aware of what is going on. So that sight distance is important. Again, the traffic volume, and then of course, wayfinding is also critical. So this is just one of the tables that kind of helps you really walk through what are my options and how do I get to my preferred solution at my particular location. And ultimately, what then occurred after all of that is you see, I'm going to jump back, folks, is you see that a matrix of sorts was then created, in this case for Massachusetts, that's what they created. And then on the left is TDOT's draft language. Hopefully I'm not sharing any trade secrets, folks, but this is draft language where, look at how specific that is there in that table. It says max of V3, V4, and V5 at the exit. Okay, so that is V3 is your exit out. V4 is going to be your left, and V5 will be your right movement. Okay, and then V1 is your entry, right? So V1 at the bottom, I should show here, V1 over here on the 2-lane entry, and then V5 is your right-hand turn, right? So that's tying right back to the geometry. So you guys have already integrated that geometry piece that I talked about, the speed piece, the traffic volume piece. Okay, so those are all components of what you're using as the measures to make the decisions on your projects. So I'm going to stop there. Jessica, how are we doing for time as well as questions?
Let's see, there's no new questions. We have about 25 minutes.
So one other piece of research that's fairly new, that wasn't specific to roundabouts, but it's super informative, is NCHRP report 948. So it is the guide for pedestrian and bicycle safety at alternative and other intersections and interchanges. There is this checklist here that what they're calling the 20 flags for peds and bikes, that if you're not familiar with this, and again, it's fairly new, but it also is providing additional information for guiding you to get to the best alternative for safety, for accessibility, and for operations at all innovative and alternative types of intersections, which roundabouts are included in that group quite often. Again, I go back to what you guys have presented thus far, or Tennessee is presented thus far for your language and your draft guidance, and that is great. What you're doing there is great. And again, engineering judgment, professional judgment is also so important. And speaking to the advocates in your own state, in your own community, is also very important, because again, not everyone agrees on what might be always the best treatment, but we need to be able to document. And the great thing now is we've got research behind the treatments. We've got results, and we've got before and after performance in locations all across the country. So, Jessica, do we have any other questions? I know we've got the case study, and I don't know if we want to, how we want to transition to that, or if we want to take some more. Actually, maybe I'm just going to jump and stop sharing for a second.
I think this might be a good time to jump into the case study. This
Okay.
has been some really good information so far.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions before we jump into the case study? Okay, so yeah, I think we can move forward.
All right, so one other piece I'm going to do here is, I want to share, so I think we're going to talk a little bit about railroads. Here's a project. Fairly, if you go to Google, it's not a roundabout yet, but this is an intersection location. Two state highways. You've actually got a railroad track over here. It's actually 2 tracks just to the west of an intersection. And so here it is. Actually, if you go down to Street View, you can actually see it as a roundabout. So this is on the west side of the roundabout itself. You can see the roundabout ahead sign, the 15 miles per hour on the advisory speed plate. You actually see the signal. The signal is actually in advance of the track right there. I'm going to go a little closer so you can see there. You're actually, again, part of it's because of the distance away of that track from the roundabout itself. But you can see there that you've got a full-on signal with the cross bucks that are going to come across for that particular location. So let's keep going. What you actually have what they've actually done is they've actually have, when the train goes through, again, this is all connected, right? So this, for the signal folks, it's all connected, where they actually restrict movements. So that goes to dark, but when the train goes through, they're actually restricting the movements at this location, where you actually can't turn left. One more. So this is one. So this is a Wisconsin DOT project. This is one that we're watching. I've been trying to get all the details that went into this in terms of the phases that this actually has as options when the trains go through at this particular location. Notice from a pedestrian perspective, it actually just, there's nothing unique here. It is what you might call high visibility crossing at with a concrete multi-lane, but it just has the crosswalk itself. But I am going to mention, I'm going to jump to this first. Georgia DOT, their roundabout guidance, and they actually have a whole section. The pedestrian section really just refers to everything we just talked about, which is all the research. It refers to the same research that your draft guidance speaks to. But they have a whole section on roundabout and rail crossing and preemption options. They've got like 5 or 6 different options for crosswalks. In this case, the blank sign outs. That's really, I don't know any other DOT that has this yet, to be honest. We think this is the first DOT that actually has specific guidance on various options for railroads and roundabouts. Again, here it doesn't speak, there's nothing special, quote unquote, for the pedestrians at this particular location or for in these examples. Here, it's really focusing on the rail grade crossing part of it at the roundabout. But I encourage you to check out what they have. They actually just came out at the very, very end of 2021 was this updated guidance. Again, no other state, to my knowledge, has this much detail on the rail grade crossing near a roundabout. So at this point, I don't know, Jessica, if you've got additional details about this particular project, it's going to be tough to see, but on the upper left, you can see that there's proposed flashing beacon assembly. I'm just going to read it. Flashing beacon assembly, pedestrian activated RFB, is to be a crosswalk warning sign, solar powered flashing assembly, complete with PROAG compliant push button with audible feedback and wireless communications for paired rectangular rapid flash beacons. And then there's a footnote. So if Jessica, if you or someone familiar with the project want to provide some additional background for our discussion, that'd be great.
Stanley or Steve Bryan, if y'all want to unmute and give some information on this.
Basically, problems that we were having at this particular roundabout, we had the railroad, which is to the east of the roundabout. I believe it was about a couple of 100 feet from the roundabout, or 150 feet or so from the crossing. We had concerns about when the train came and it went into the preemption mode, how that would affect the pedestrian crossings if we had push buttons there and the traffic flowing in and out of the roundabout.
Okay, so, and I have my like mapping up. I just didn't know of this, I didn't know the exact location of this. Would it help to show an aerial of the existing location, or I don't, if not, that's fine. We can just go off of this. So you're saying about 150 feet to the right side of the screen?
That's correct. This
okay.
Project has not been built yet. It's under design. It's coming off of, I believe I-55 is to the south and west of Crump Boulevard in Memphis, Tennessee.
Okay.
And it's is it I-55 in Crump?
That's correct.
Which is under construction. Is that correct? Or
It's still in the design phase.
Yeah, still in design. Okay.
So the intent at the tracks was to have, so basically you've got 150 feet between the intersection and the roundabout. So once the crossbucks go down, the roundabout will still be flowing until it potentially fills up, or the queue fills up between the intersection and the crossbucks.
That's correct. And our concerns were if we had the flashing beacons for the pedestrians to cross, how that would interfere with the preemption of the railroad, because the vehicles will need to be able to clear the track and clear the roundabout. And if there was some congestion in the roundabout, how's all that going to tie together?
Okay. So there are the options that you could do, because with any, whether it's an RFB or a PHB or a signal, there's the hot button, right? So the hot button is you push it and it's going to react immediately to the person. Either the flashing beacon goes on, or the PHB starts its sequence, or the signal starts its sequence. Or, so the hot button versus it has some sort of timing, if you will, that the pedestrian may actually have to wait. I think the tricky part here is that it's a dynamic situation with a train. Is there a typical time or train in terms of length and time that it goes through? Is it 30 seconds? Is it a minute? Is there a way to connect them? Have you talked about connecting? So the clearly the RFB is a little different than if you were to have the traditional signal or the pedestrian hybrid beacon at this location. I guess my concern is that if people are in a queue, do they not pay attention to the pedestrians then if they hit the RFB to cross? Because clearly if everyone's queued up and they can't go anywhere, the pedestrian, if the crosswalk is clear, they could cross at the particular location. I don't know. I guess I'm not sure that, I don't know if there's an advantage to making pedestrians wait if cars are queued up. Open to discussion. I'm just kind of brainstorming here in terms of, I'm just trying to think of the sequence of events once that crossbuck goes down and cars start to queue back, and then you've got pedestrians wanting to cross. Have you done a simulation like in VSIM or anything with this?
We actually have a consultant that's doing all the work on this. Okay. And as I stated, we're still in the design phase. We're getting ready to turn this project in probably within the next month or so. Okay. And these are just some questions that came up during our conversations with the designer and the railroad. They had large concerns about the preemption, because when the railroad is preempted, the traffic has to come off the leg. There's no questions about that. And me personally, I think it should override any pedestrian push buttons at that time.
Right. Yes. So what are the things? So a lot of the other roundabout rail projects that I have been involved with, we have tried to do some sort of a simulation, just to see. But again, so I mean, basically, cars are going to be stopped. That's clear. They're not going to be able. They got to get out, and then they're going to potentially. There could be a queue, correct? Unless you've got a gate. Where would the gates be in that 150-foot? Are cars going to be allowed to queue? I'm gonna draw. I don't know. Can you guys see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so let's say the railroad's over here on the edge of the screen. Are cars going to be allowed to queue right here? So basically
To my
between.
To my knowledge now, yes, that's the way we're leaving that, because we're not having any gates on any of the other legs at all.
Okay. Okay. So they would just queue up to where the gate is by the tracks. They could potentially spill back. But again, for pedestrians, like if they're just moving from one side of the intersection to the other, they could still technically go from, let's say, the south side of the road to the north side of the road, even if the cars are stand still. Are there gates at the crosswalks at the tracks? Or does the big gate come and actually stop in front of the road and the crosswalk itself, or the sidewalk?
Yes, they'll have gates going down across the roadway.
Right. And so the question would be is if a pedestrian is going from north to south or south to north on that leg, even though cars are queued up here potentially, and chances are they've cleared out of here, coming away from the tracks, is there any reason to not allow the pedestrians to cross? And now keep in mind, the RFB is just a flashing beacon, so it's not going to say don't cross. And I would say, is there a reason that the pedestrians couldn't cross in that time where traffic is stopped? And I don't know, in my head, I'm thinking, well, why wouldn't we allow them to cross at that point in time?
I was thinking more about the crossing just to the west of the track and not any of the other legs.
Right here. Is that
yes.
where you're, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
that would be my major concerns, would be on that particular leg there.
Okay. So yeah, because you want them, okay, so they're gonna go, like I'm just envisioning, okay, so there's the tracks, the gates have come down, the cars that are going, I'm gonna say westbound or westbound, northbound, they can keep going, right? So they've made it across the tracks, they're gonna keep going, and then there basically should probably be no cars on that westbound to northbound, right? Once they clear out. And then eastbound, those cars will get queued up because they're going to have to stop at the tracks.
That's correct.
And I don't see why you would need to stop pedestrians from crossing north-south. And they're going to clearly have to be careful because they're going to be crossing traffic that's queued for sure on that one leg.
Well, as I stated, I was more concerned about the crossings on the east side and not the north or south or west side of the.
Right, but right here, they'd be crossing from north to south or south to north.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any reason why those heads couldn't just carry on because they're just going north and south.
I think we've had this conversation, and I think the concern is the conflict between a car stopping to let pedestrian cross versus needing to go through it to clear the railroad tracks. I don't know if that's a concern or not, but I think that's what Stanley's trying to describe. Like if their preemption is basically green, cars go, clear the track, but they can't go because they've stopped for a pedestrian up ahead. Is there a concern there or not?
Yeah, and so maybe I should have started with the fundamental question. What is the traffic volume here and what is the anticipated pedestrian volume at this location?
I don't think we have any pedestrian volumes noted at this intersection. And off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what the ADTs are going into the roundabout.
Okay. So I would say then it's possible. So hot button, again, hot button meaning as soon as the pedestrian hits it, they could go. That's where you could actually, again, consistency is important because pedestrians become accustomed to, if I hit the button, I always get to go here. And now all of a sudden I hit the button, it's saying, wait, wait. You can do, like, you could create that at the RFB where it's not a hot button, you accessible pedestrian button, you push the button and it actually will tell you to wait, which then ties back to what's going on at the railroad track until, and again, loop detectors is what, or video detection, depending on what you have out there. Loop detectors come to mind where if there is a queue, that RFB would sit and wait until the queue was gone, and then you could cross. But to make that pedestrian wait, because once it clears, I would hate to really make the pedestrians stay up there at this side for the train to cross when there's no cars any longer. So it's
Well,
that clearance. It's that clearance that's so important.
Yes, the clearance interval of the preemption.
And that's where I think you could. I think that the key is that that shouldn't be a hot, again, that hot button. So they can't activate it. They would actually have to wait until that's cleared. But again, that would require the connectivity, either a loop detector or something that would allow that beacon to know that there's no cars in the queue and now it's just nothing because the gates are down and no one's going to come from that direction anymore until the gates go up. Is that making any sense? The hot button is what I think you don't want based on what I've heard. You actually want the pedestrians to wait till it's cleared. And with an RFB or anything, you're gonna have to audible tell them, wait, wait, wait. But the question is how long do you make them wait? And the only way, you either make them wait the whole time or you somehow have it connected to a loop or whatever technology you might be using to then know that the clear is queue, or the queue is cleared, and then that they can activate it and they could, a flashing beacon is on, or whatever the words are that would go with that audible. Does that make any sense?
I think it makes sense. Like I stated, I think the only questions that I would have there is just doing the initial preemption, initial clearance time.
Yeah.
That we would get the traffic off of the tracks and into the roundabout, and the pedestrians could conceivably be able to activate their buttons and cross until the track clearance. Once they clear, we want to get the traffic flowing again. How much time do we need to allow that to happen, or do we go ahead and let the pedestrians just go back and have their active hot buttons per se, as you stated?
Yeah, and I think that again, great point, is once you have them clearing, and that's where you also, maybe there's like a minimum. So they're queued back behind the tracks. They can now, the train's gone by, they're coming back through. And again, that's where you also would have, whatever the number is, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever it happens to be, you make them wait until they come back through. But again, I envision supplemental signing, right? You've got the audible, you've got supplemental signing, and particularly if that crossing, those crossings, I'll call it, those crossings on that east side, if that's gonna somehow look different than all the other crossings, it goes back to, Vita, was it you that said? No, someone mentioned consistency. That consistency becomes really important in terms of all those crossings. Because if they think it's going to be hot, you know what I'm saying? Like, they might think I'm going to hit it and then the flashing beacon's going to come on. But I think you've got it. Like to me, you've thought through it in terms of, I think the key is it can't be a hot button when you're trying to either clear it off the tracks, or then actually once you release it, you're going to give some priority to the cars clearing, and actually make the pedestrians wait during that phase, if you will, when the train has either coming or has just left. So my takeaways are consistency. Would you do it to all of them? And secondly, the timing, knowing what it's going to take to clear. And that's where, again, some of the other projects with railroads that I have worked with, we've actually done a quick little simulation in VSIM or whatever other software you guys might be using to kind of simulate that. So you can kind of get an idea of what is the right amount of time given, because the queue, right? It's the old, you've got that delay from when the crosswalks go up, and then finally you get the cars to actually get rolling and moving out, and how many cars, and then they got to travel 150 feet. So there's that time too. A quick simulation, and you probably could do it. You could probably simulate it in Synchro or something too. I'm just trying to think of an easy tool. You could probably figure out that from a timing perspective, and then know what you might need to do for those pedestrians to have to wait for those kind of clearance intervals. So those are my thoughts.
There was one more question, and I know we are at 4:31. Yeah. But there was one more question that I thought maybe we can address, and if people have to drop, then that's fine. Again, this is recorded, but Chris Armstrong, one of our safety managers, asked, do you have any examples of rural applications? I think all the examples were urban. If they weren't, let me know. But do you have any rural applications of roundabouts?
So let me clarify, rural applications with signals PHBs or just general rural?
Actually, that was my follow-up question too. Chris, if you can unmute, if you're still here.
Yeah, I guess, or to what level of pedestrian would we include? Because a lot of the areas we've been working in the last several years and have a larger focus on are rural settings, and there's hardly any other existing pedestrian facilities. And usually that is the bottom of the pile for the locals to create any kind of network, connecting into things like this.
Yes. So more often than not, most rural applications, and there's kind of a rural one on the left there that I just put up, is most of them are single lane. And so when we talk about single lane roundabouts, we oftentimes are just talking about the high visibility crosswalk marking and a sign. The focus from the US Access Board and the accessibility has really been on the multi-lane side. And it's not that you don't have an occasional multi-lane roundabout in a rural environment, but and that's where, again, I think there's a good example there on the left where you can see that the crosswalks were put in. There is, a landing area and accessible, the truncated domes, but then it doesn't lead to any ped infrastructure. However, we know in the rural environment, the shoulder can be pedestrian infrastructure, where you kind of create, in some agencies, they'll do like they'll do not paved. Some will pave from the ped crosswalk to ped crosswalk, even though it's not tying to any other ped infrastructure, or do some sort of reinforced kind of gravel or material between. So on the left here, I'm talking like between the crosswalk or the ramp here and the ramp here, and just kind of connect that around the circulatory roadway. But again, it's not necessarily leading to It's not necessarily leading to pet infrastructure except for a shoulder. Some state DOTs have taken the position that they are going to do that, whether it's rural or urban. Florida, Georgia come to mind, that they are going to, even in rural environments or in areas where they kind of transition areas where they don't historically see PEDs, they're still kind of providing that, but they're not connecting it. And they're looking at either reinforced, again, gravel or just paving around kind of the diameter, if you will, to provide that connectivity around the roundabout itself. But not typically, we're not seeing the RFBs, the PHBs, or raised crosswalks in rural environments. Does that help, Chris?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. All right, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing. And so Jessica, I can provide you the copy of the slides. I know you did a recording. I jumped around a couple of times just because of some of the questions that came up, but I'm happy to provide that you can share to the entire group. And if there's any other additional questions, or we can do some one-on-one with maybe specific projects or other thoughts, I'm happy to do that and with you.
Well, we thank you so much for sharing with us today, Hillary. It was very, very informational. I don't think I've seen a lot. You showed a lot of the step in the countermeasures at roundabouts. I don't think I've really seen much of that. But again, we hadn't, a lot of my training, I didn't deal with roundabouts or whatever. And so, and then the road diet and the roundabout, like I was just blown away. So thank you so much. This was awesome. And everyone that's on the call, feel free to reach out to me if you can't get to Hillary, because Hillary is always very accessible. Thank y'all so much for hanging in a little past our 4:30 time stop. And I see Vita typing a message. I just want to make sure she doesn't have anything before we close. Okay, she said great information. Thank you. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, my pleasure. Take care, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
All right, good night.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.